a 22mm socket, let's remove all these caps that hold on the center cap for your lug nuts. Set this aside, and then with a 22mm socket as well, go ahead and remove all 8 of your lug nuts, and then we'll remove the wheel. Before we go further, I'm going to take a pry bar, stick it in here, and just try to compress the pistons of the caliper a little bit. That'll make it easier to take this off. With a 17mm socket, I'm going to remove the 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. Get this top one off first. And with these off, take your caliper, slide it off of the caliper bracket and the pads, set it on top of the leaf spring so it doesn't put any pressure on your brake hose. Now you can remove the pads, just slide them out of the bracket. This one's a little bit stuck, so I'm going to use a pry bar. There we go. Now with an 18mm socket, I want to remove these 2 bolts that mount the bracket onto the knuckle. So I'm going to do this one with my air gun, but this one, obviously I can't fit anything but a hand tool in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take this one out first. But I will leave it in a few threads, that way I can hold the bracket in while I take off the top. Go ahead and break this free. Helps if you have a long ratchet or a breaker bar that you can get in here. You can either use a ratcheting wrench, a regular wrench, or a 3/8 drive ratchet. Usually it'll fit in here, and you can take the bolt all the way out. Once you get it loose enough, you can do this by hand. Just make sure you don't get your tool stuck in between here. That's not going to be fun. Take the bracket off. Take your rotor off. The next thing I want to do is spray some brake parts cleaner all over to get rid of all the dust, brake dust and debris, sand, anything that might be here, so I can have a nice clean working area, including, and obviously including back here by the parking brake shoes, because these collect a lot of dust over time. Next, I'm going to pull the axle with these 19mm bolts. Once you remove those, the axle comes out, and then we can move the hub away, and then we can do our job. So, like I said, 19mm socket, remove all of these. There we go. Mine had a bunch of gasket maker on them, so I'm just going to remove all of that, make sure the threads are nice and clean for installation. I'm going to tap this with a hammer to hopefully break it free. There we go. Gear oil will come out, so I have a drain pan underneath. Slowly and gently remove the axle, support it so that you don't ruin any seals. Okay. Going to use a brand new razor blade to scrape things off. Of course, try to scrape towards the outside, not the inside. scrape away any debris that might have got in here. Now we have to remove this large nut that's in here. You can see, but it's locked in with a C-clip. So with a large pick, I'm gonna try to, but it's locked in with a little snap ring, lock ring thing. So I'm just gonna take a pick and try to pick this out of here. There we go. With a magnet, go ahead and pull this locking pin out that sits here at the top. And then I'm going to count the threads to know how many threads in this ring was so that I can put it back exactly the way it was before. I have 5 visible threads here, so that's what I'm going to go by. And I'm actually going to mark the ring right here so that I know this is the top. I'm going to use a permanent marker and just make a line right here. And that way I know that this is the top facing towards the outside. So with my pick, I'm going to go ahead and just back this off. There it is. Now grab your hub assembly and wiggle it. Now that this is loose with a pry bar, go ahead and pry this off. There we go. Remove your hub assembly with the bearings. So I'm going to use a pry bar and put it underneath the seal here. Make sure it's in all the way so that it goes to the edge of it. Otherwise, it'll just pop out the middle part. And then you could either give it a couple taps with your hand. If that doesn't work, you can use a hammer. Basically, what I'm trying to do is pop the seal out of here. I'm going to try a slightly different method here. I'm going to use a chisel bit and lift up this edge here. Maybe then I can pop it off with my pry bar. If you take 2 pry bars, do this. Get some extra prying. There we go. There's your seal. Next, I want to grab this bearing and just pull it straight out. I'm going to set it to the side here. So now with the seal out, you can remove your inner bearing, and I strongly recommend replacing both the inner and the outer at once. If you're going to do this, you don't want to have to go through all this trouble again. So the race for the inner bearing does fit through the race of the outer, so you can remove the inner with reusing the outer bearing, but I strongly recommend replacing both, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to pull this race out and then that race out and so on. So at this point, to press this bearing out, you can use whatever you have to press it out from the inside. So I'm going to give this punch a shot and just go back and forth all around the outer race of this bearing and just walk it out of here. Typically, you'd want to flip this over. I'm going to try and do it without so that you can see what's happening. But basically, you just want to punch it out of here. The trick here is to apply even pressure all around. You don't want this to start going at an angle because then it just gets jammed in there. So now with the bearing race out of there, I want to clean up the surface and inspect it to make sure that it is good to reuse, which it should be, but you never know. So at this point, we will do the same thing to that inner bearing, except that that one has a snap ring. So I'm going to get some of the oil off of there so we can clearly see the snap ring. You'll need some snap ring pliers. We'll take that out, and then we basically do the same thing to drive that race out of there.
let's just take the snap ring out. I'm going to put this pry bar in on the edge of the snap ring so that it doesn't want to go back into its slot. So before I remove this snap ring, I want to make sure that it breaks free. Sometimes you have one side that gets stuck. So I'm just going to cause some vibration with my punch on the snap ring. A lot of times that helps break it free, because if one side is stuck, you're going to have a hard time removing it. Not because of rust, just because of pressure from the wheel bearing. Perfect. There we go. Squeeze this in, lift it up, just like this. Watch out so it doesn't go flying. Release it, set this aside, inspect it. It should still be in good condition, but in case it's not, you would want to buy a brand new one, because this is what locks in your outer bearing. And if this fails or breaks or whatever, well, you're going to have a bad situation. So set this aside, because we will reuse it. And now we will be able to punch out that bearing this way. It comes out the same way through the back. I'm going to wipe off the area a little bit so I can see what's going on better. All right, let's flip this over. So at this point, I'm going to use the same punch, go down through these cutouts here. That's what these are for, so you can punch the outer race out. And I'm just going to walk it down just like we did the other one. The key here is even pressure back and forth. Okay, there we go. There's the inner bearing, or the outer bearing, with the outer race. Obviously this one is damaged because we beat it out of there, but either way we're replacing it. So set that aside. We'll clean up the area just like we did before, inspect it, and we'll get ready for installation. So I took a rag, cleaned out everywhere in there. The surface is ready for the new bearing. And to install this new bearing, you'll need a bearing and seal installer. It looks like this. I used this adapter that fits on the outer part of the bearing. It's important to not press on the rollers themselves or on this ring here. You want to press on the outer race. That's what you press down into. And you want to make sure that you put it the right way. Don't put it backwards. So it goes with the tapered part facing out on the outside of the hub, or down in this case. And so you have to make sure that you put both of them together in at once, because otherwise you won't be able to get the bearing in from the other side. So put them together like this. I'm going to drop them down into the hole. The bearing's going to separate from the outer race, but that's fine. They'll meet again. And take your tool, and it's going to be hard to show you this because I have to hammer straight down, but basically what I'm doing is I'm going on the outer edge of this race here, and I'm just going to use a hammer and drive it down into its spot until it is 100% bottomed out. So position it, make sure that it is centered, take your tool and drive it in. Of course, you want to check it along the way to make sure that nothing is going in crooked, which it is slightly. Continuously checking it. All right, so it looks like almost bottomed out. Give it a couple more hits. Okay, I noticed an audible difference. That means the bearing has completely bottomed itself out. This will wobble around a little bit. That's normal. This is never going to get crushed. If it gets crushed, that's an issue, actually, because then it can't spin anymore. So this is supposed to have a little bit of play. The play will get removed when you install the locking nut on it, on the outside. So at this point, you can inspect the race to make sure that it is fully bottomed out. If you can see the snap ring groove all around and it looks like it's flush with the outer race, you are good to go, which in my case it is. So we are ready to install the snap ring. Okay, let's put the snap ring in here. Okay. head out in a second. Pinch it down, slide it into the groove, let go, and of course now you'd want to double check it. The way I'm going to do that is just with a little punch and a hammer. Just tap it, that way you ensure that it is seated 100% all the way around, and it looks like it is perfectly seated, so we are good to go. Bearing still spins, race is set. At this point all we have to do is put in the inner bearing. That was the outer bearing, this is the inner bearing, and it goes in the opposite direction, so the taper faces outwards towards the inside of the hub, that would be. So we'll press this one down as well. Once you're ready to install this inner bearing, if you don't have an installer that is big enough, obviously this one goes right through, so I don't want to hammer on the edge of this. That's going to completely ruin this race. I'm going to take the old bearing with the old race, sit them right on top of here, and my installer fits on the inner race of this bearing, which obviously it's the old one, so I don't care if I ruin it. So I'm just going to use this to hammer everything down. There we go. It's going in at an angle. So to correct it, I'm just going to very, very gently punch it out from the other side. So I have to punch this out over here. Very light taps. You don't want to ruin anything. Thankfully, the bottom side is actually the thicker ridge here, so you don't have to worry about necessarily tapping on the inner part of the race where the bearings actually roll onto, but still be careful and go very gentle. All right, so I brought it even. Now, in order to start seating it a little bit better, I'm just going to tap on the outer part of this old race. So it started going down quite a bit, so I'm just going to put the bearing in, use this. This will drive it in a lot faster and definitely more even. All right, so let's see where we're at. Okay, so this race is starting to get pressed in there. This is the old race. I'm going to have to pop it out of here very gently. I'm going to flip it over and just very, very gently pop it out of its spot without scratching the new race. There we go. So the ridge that the race presses in is actually longer, deeper than the race itself. So what you can do now is you can take a brass punch if you have one, or you can just continue with this, press this one a little bit in, and then punch it out. You just risk scratching the inner surface of the new race if you're doing that and punching it out. So what I'm going to do is take a brass punch, finish driving this in until it's completely bottomed out. Okay, it's seated all the way. We can put the bearing in. Moves around perfectly smooth, no issues. And now it's time to put the seal on. It's time to install the seal. Go ahead and make sure that it starts in nice and even. If you have a seal installer that will go around the outside of this, go ahead and use that. You don't want to press on the inner part. Whether it's a two-piece seal or not, you never want to press on the inside. You always want to press on the outside. This happens to be a two-piece seal, so the inside part actually spins on the outer piece. So you definitely want to press right on the edge here. And I was thinking about using this, but unfortunately, even though it is big enough to press on the metal part, it is right on the inner lip of it. So I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that because it might squish it down. So I'm going to start it in with a rubber mallet on the outside. And then if you wanted to, you could flip the whole hub over and press it in evenly, but it looks like this is going down pretty smooth. And what I meant by flipping the hub over is you can use the weight of the hub and put this on a flat surface, clean flat surface that is, and just apply pressure and it should go in, but it looks like this one's pretty much seated all the way at this point. So that looks good. We'll go around one more time just to double check. Perfect. So now take your hub. I have some gear oil here. I'm just gonna put a little bit of gear oil on the bearings. I'll work this in a little bit, that way the bearings don't go in dry. Now let's take the hub assembly with the bearings, slide it all on. There we go. Work that grease in a little bit and press it over all the way in. In order to ensure that it's seated, try to pull it back out. It shouldn't come off very easily. For me, it took a little bit of force. There we go. Everything feels nice and smooth. Now let's put this locking ring on, which is also what secures your bearings and the hub and everything. I'm just going to use this pick to drive it in. Makes it a little faster. And now, at this point, you would want a special tool. It looks like this. That drops right down into these slots, and you use this to turn it. You want to torque this to 52 foot-pounds. Once it's tight, see if you can move the bearing around a little bit. If it's too tight, that's normal, because then you have to back it off and move the bearing, or turn the hub with it backed off a little bit so that you can seat those bearings in. And then the final adjustment should just be finger tight. Like, you should tighten it until you can just stop turning it with your fingers, and that's it. These should not be torqued down, otherwise you will crush the bearings and ruin them very, very fast. Okay, so I used my tool, made this pretty tight, and it's pretty hard to turn this bearing now, or the hub, and that's normal. But you do want to try and turn it a few times, and that'll seat the bearings properly. Typically you'd want to go the other direction. There we go. And it should get very slightly looser. The nut shouldn't back off, but turning it should be a little bit easier. So at this point, we want to use our tool, back this off until it is loose, and then we'll tighten it finger tight. All right, so I loosened it up with my tool. I just snugged it up a little so that I can kind of gauge the tightness of it. And this is now loose enough to where I can literally spin it freely with my pick. So I'm just going to take my fingers, and basically you just want to go until the first hole lines up. That's that one over there. So do this, and at this point you have this little locking pin in here, which is essential. This is what's going to prevent this from backing off. And then of course, to lock the locking pin in, you use the snap ring. I have a little pick to help drive this on all the way. Just find a thread that it wants to sit on, and just follow that thread all around. Make sure it is fully seated. Okay, that looks good. Give this a spin. Spins easily. That's perfect. So ideally you would want to put a gasket here. I'm pretty sure usually it's a paper gasket. I don't have one. You can use RTV, but you just want to make sure you use very, very little, very thin layer. I'm going to put some on here in between the bolt holes, and then I'll use my clean glove. You don't want an oily glove. That defeats the purpose of the RTV sticking. And I'm just going to spread it around to make it a nice even coat of RTV. Again, if you put too much, well, it's going to squish out, get in the middle there, and it's just not going to be great. Might not even make a very good seal. So I'm just going to go around everywhere and apply it evenly, and then we will put the axle in. And before I tighten these bolts, because I'm using RTV, usually you can just snug them right up and torque them to spec. But because I'm using this gasket maker, I want to wait for it to harden a little bit before I actually do the full torque. So you'll see me putting the bolts in, bottoming them out, and maybe giving them a little snug, but then I won't torque them. I'm going to wait about half an hour before the RTV sets in, dries up a little bit, and then I will go to the full torque spec. At this point, you want to make sure that your axle shaft is clean, free of debris. Of course, I cleaned up this surface here too, and it is ready to be installed. Slide it through, support it as you slide it in. find where the hole is in the differential. Oh, there we go. And at this point, there we go. You want to be gentle on the last step because you don't want to push all the gears inside and kind of dislodge them. Okay, let's get some bolts in here. Line up your bolt holes, start in your bolts. I'm going to start this one on all the way, that way it'll hold the axle into place. Start this one on all the way, and once two are in completely, then basically everything else will line up just fine. So let's get them all in. If your threads are dirty, go ahead and clean them up. I cleaned some of them up because they were a little bit dirty with the old gasket on them, and someone had already put some RTV on here. All right, let's give these a quick snug, and then I will wait, like I said, to fully torque it. So snugging these up, I'm going to go in a cross pattern, and I'm holding my ratchet by the head of the ratchet, so I'm not applying a lot of torque. And the reason I'm going in a cross pattern is to fully seat the RTV evenly. Even if you're using a pre-made gasket, it's good to go in a cross pattern to squish it down evenly. So I'm going to leave it like this for 20 minutes, half an hour. Then I'll come back and do a full pass with the torque wrench all around. So it's been about half an hour, and I want to torque these. If you have the 10.5 rear end, then you want to torque them to 115 foot-pounds. If you have the 11.5 rear end, you want to torque them to 136 foot-pounds. So pick your appropriate torque spec depending on your application. And like I said, I'm going to go in a cross pattern. I'm going to hold the hub with a pry bar. That's all of them. I'm going to go around in a circle, just double check them. Okay, they're all tight. Now I want to clean up the hub surface where the rotor mounts on. It's basically rust-free completely. I just want to clean off the remaining potential grease here with some brake parts cleaner. I'm going to clean off the studs too. I noticed some of them have grease on them, which they're not supposed to. All right, and then I'll just coat it with some anti-seize. That way it doesn't rust in the future. Put some anti-seize here, just a thin layer. I'm going to spread it out, but I just want to apply some everywhere, and then I'll just go around. Try not to get it on the lug studs if possible, and try to get it on this ridge right here on the hub part where the rotor sits, because a lot of times it will seize up on there. If it's going to seize up anywhere, it's most likely going to be right there on that ridge. Let's take our rotor, slide it on. I do want to mention, if you have a lot of rust buildup inside there where it mounts onto the hub, you want to go ahead and clean that off. Mine is in pretty good condition, so I'm not worried about it. So I'm going to slide this on all the way. Let's put on the caliper bracket, line it up with the 2 bolt holes, and slide in the bolts. There's 1, Let's bottom these out, and then we'll torque them to 122 foot-pounds. That's one. If you wanted to put anything on these bolts, you should put thread locker, definitely not anti-seize or grease, just as a side note. And that's two. Let's get the pads in. If for some reason your pads are having a hard time sliding in, it's probably because you have rust buildup in there, in which case you'd have to just clean it up with a wire brush or sand it down or whatever, and make sure you put some grease in there if needed. Do the same with the sliders. My sliders are good, but if they need to be greased up, go ahead and do that. Now take your caliper, slide it over the pads and over the bracket. Make sure it all lines up. The slider pins have like a straight cutout here that basically lines up with the flat part on the caliper. Grab your two mounting bolts. Slide those in, bottom them out, and then torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Okay, if your slider spins like this, you can grab it with some pliers and hold it still. That's one. And that's two. Perfect. Let's put the wheel back on. Put all your lug nuts on, bottom them out, and then torque them to 140 foot-pounds. All right, just double check them all one more time. Don't forget about this cover if you have one. Again, 22mm socket, just like we did to take it off, except for this one. Don't use an impact gun or anything like that on it, because these plastic inserts, they strip out really fast and then they won't grip, and then your cover is going to go flying down the road. So just do these by hand, make them nice and snug, and you should be all set. At this point, I want to check the fill level of the differential since we lost some fluid. So with a 3/8 extension or just the straight up ratchet, go ahead and remove this drain or fill plug. There we go. So at this point, as you could see, my differential was overfilled to begin with. So I'm not going to add any, but you would technically add gear oil of the right viscosity. You can check in your owner's manual. And assuming that none came out when you pulled the plug, which it shouldn't, go ahead and stick the bottle in, fill it up until it starts to drip out, kind of like this, just a little trickle. That's exactly what you want. And then you would want to cap it off. Again, I'm not going to add any because to begin with, I was over full here on the differential, so I don't want to make it even more full. I actually brought it down to the proper level. So let's put this back, snug it up, and then I will show you how to tip the differential so that you can prime those new bearings with oil. When you snug this up, just go until it bottoms out and then give it a tiny bit extra. Don't go crazy tight on it because it'll get stuck. And of course, wipe down the mess here because you don't want to think that it's a leak when it's just residual oil. One last step before you take it out and drive it is to tip the differential to prime those bearings. And to do that, I'm going to put my jack right about here. I'm going to lower the van onto it, and that's going to tip this whole rear end down like that. It's going to force all the oil to flow into the bearings and it'll soak them up. And then after about 10 minutes or so, you can bring it back up, put it on a flat level surface and take it for a drive. But it's important to do this because you don't want to wear the bearings out prematurely. So let's go down slowly. And I'm going to keep going a little bit. Kind of like that. And I'm just going to let it sit like this for 5 to 10 minutes. That should be plenty of time for oil to start making its way into those bearings. Now, of course, I'm on a lift, so I can do this the way you see it set up here, but if you're on the ground on jack and jack stands, just take the jack stands out and jack up one side of the differential. It's as easy as that. Okay, let's take the jack out of here, drop this down, and then you can take it for a road test.